Hi, welcome. This is David back with Daniel. Today we're gonna talk about some issues in the philosophy of games. There's a topic we're both interested in for maybe slightly different reasons, maybe some similar reasons. I think we're both involved in games in various ways. So we're going to talk about, in particular, we're going to talk about something called the gamer's dilemma, which we'll explain in due course. And we may also get into some conceptual issues about what are games, how are games different or similar, different from or similar to life in general or art, different artistic media. So yeah, let's maybe get going. So I thought maybe we could begin by saying a little bit of how we're approaching this topic or what our background is with this topic. So maybe Daniel, do you want to explain your own relationship to games, maybe?
Yeah, so recently this topic has been gaining more traction because of the release of GTA. I think it's GTA 6 or something. So it's becoming more of, I guess actually, I remember like 10, 20 years ago, this also becoming a topic. Violence in video games, arguments, does it have an effect in society, whether it's games or movies? Um, that was argued a lot 10, 20 years ago. Now there's a slightly different argument, but it's also related to these new games that have been coming out. But from my perspective, I have some connection with games because I do game once in a while. PUBG and CS:GO, the games where you shoot your friends. Not quite as violent as GTA, but still in the same kind of format of violence for the purpose of entertainment. Um, and so it brings up a kind of interesting moral or ethical question. But I'm also interested in the game theory from other perspectives too. How games relate to society, how games relate to our understanding of the world, how game mechanics operate in real life settings. And I know that you also are coming from some of the same ways, but also some of the different ways because you are going to be talking about games and art.
Right. So one topic I've been interested in recently is I've been studying a lot of aesthetic theory. I also have a 9-year-old son who is very attracted to video games, so I'm exposed a lot to different kinds of video games. I played some, growing up. I played some games with my family. I think my family was always a bit more oriented towards art, going to art museums, watching good movies, reading novels. We did do a little bit of gaming, but I was always drawn, I think, more to art. But I have a son who is drawn, I think, much more to games rather than to art. He'd rather play a game than read a book. So I've been interested in the relationship between art and games. A lot of philosophers have argued, and media scholars have argued that games are art, which is a position I think is a little bit confused, although there's some correct things about it too. So I've really been interested. I guess that's what I've been interested in a lot recently is the relationship between games and art. And
Yeah, you
just
made
about
an
the
interesting point. I saw in your preview to your presentation or your conference that's coming up about how a lot of scholars try to put games into the art category to make it more acceptable as a field of study. Like you said, your family was going to art museums, so they probably wouldn't have been too thrilled if their son was, playing some game in the basement. But from your point of view, you're saying that games should deserve their own category because they have just as much of a value as we would say high arts.
Yeah. And we were, of course, also, my brother and I were also playing video games in the basement. But at the same time, I think my own preference was more towards art. And I think is really clear that art has had higher cultural status in our own culture. And so I think that part of my argument is that that's one reason why game scholars have tried to argue that games are art, even though I think in a lot of ways they're clearly
Do
different. And
you
we'll get into,
see do you see that changing at all? Because I noticed that I don't know if this was the case 10, 20 years ago, but I know that in the last, well, since I've been playing the games in the last 10 years, they've been growing international competitions. The amount of money you can win for playing these games has increased incredibly. So it's become like its own industry. And I don't know if that was the case 20 years ago. Like that might be something new that's happening, and therefore games are becoming more mainstream. If you tell your friends you're a professional gamer, you tell your parents, it's not as bad as opposed I suppose it would have been 20 years ago.
Yeah. And of course, it's always been, I mean, that's another complicated aspect of this. I mean, it's always, most parents have always had trouble with, even if their kids say, I want to be a professional painter, they're like, well, how are you going to make money doing that? Even though, we put up these masterworks, we think painting is like a respectable thing once it's done and done well. But the artists have always had a difficult time. But yeah, gamers have found ways to make a living at gaming, which is a relatively new thing. I mean, before maybe you had to work in game design to actually make money. Now you can actually play games to make
Yeah.
money, and maybe that'll have an effect on kind of the status of
Yeah, well,
games.
speaking
But
of parents and stuff, this I guess comes to our topic about the morality or ethics in game culture, especially violence in games. Um, and I guess your perspective as being a parent, does this like obviously it must have more of an impact for you than it does for me because it's just theory for me. But for you, you actually at some point, I don't know if you're what your son plays, but at some point you have to make a decision of what he should or shouldn't be playing.
right. Yeah, and that is a concern. He's mostly for now interested in like racing games
Okay.
or games like Minecraft or Roblox, where there's a big like building aspect to it, create your own world, create your own whatever kinds of things. There are some things he watches, like some games that he's interested in but hasn't really played that involve kind of this cartoony violence. So far, he's not interested in like the hyper real kind of violent games, but I suppose that will happen eventually. And that's maybe a good way to get into this topic about the gamer's dilemma, which I think, I mean, maybe I will argue that it's really a question about representation more broadly and what is it or is not okay to represent in various kinds of media.
Hmm.
But I think we should maybe introduce this concept of the gamer's dilemma, which gets into questions of violence and other maybe bad acts within games and whether that's more immoral or not, or kind of amoral or immoral. Do you have
Yeah.
anything way you particularly want to introduce the gamer's dilemma? I think you were the first one who brought it up in our
Yeah, I mean, I
correspondence.
could
So
just explain a little bit about what it is. So I suppose it was introduced by Morgan Luck in 2009, so it's been around for a while. Um, and the original argument goes that for whatever reason, there is a moral intuition difference between violence in virtual games and other kinds of unpleasant behavior. I don't know. But he uses the term pedophilia and violence. He uses those two terms to distinguish what is acceptable and unacceptable in games. Violence, of course, being acceptable. Games have been violent for years. But other acts like pedophilia or rape have always been unacceptable. And his argument is trying to figure out why. Why are some acts acceptable and some acts not acceptable, even though in real life, obviously, violence is unacceptable. So is rape and pedophilia. But in a simulated world, violence somehow is okay, but rape and pedophilia are not. And why is that? He has some explanations, but they never, that's why it's called the dilemma, because they never figured out exactly why or how we can make this distinction logically. Of course, relying on intuition, we come up with what we have come up with already, but we want to know the reason why. Why do we have these intuitions?
right. Yeah, so that's a good explanation of it. Basically is does anything go in video games or not? Are there some things that are immoral to be done in video games or not? And to me, and you can maybe say whether you agree with this or don't agree with this, or what you think about it. But I think the question I mean, there's some different things about video games than other media, right? So in a video game, I mean, it's complicated. The game designer kind of sets out like these are the possibilities, right? But then you, as a player, you choose among some of these possibilities. So the game designer is in effect saying, here's all the possible things that could be represented, right? When something happens in a game, it's kind of a representation of, a possible reality maybe, or something that could happen, or a possible relationship among things. So it's a representation, we might call it. And the game designer is saying, here's all these possible representations that we're going to put into the game. And depending on how the game is played, some of these will actually get represented, some of them won't. So the game player then has a certain kind of responsibility that say a movie viewer doesn't have, in that they choose in some way, or they have some effect on which representations actually get shown to them, right?
There's
Whereas,
also a lack of interactivity. So there are some movies that depict rape scenes, but
right.
you are a passive viewer. You're not engaging in from the position of the perpetrator. So
Mhm.
that I guess that would make a difference between games and movies. But on the other hand, there is, like you said, representation issue. I think this gamers dilemma applies to any kind of representation. So
I think
violence in
so, yeah.
movies, like why are some movies, the whole movie just some John Wick going around murdering people for the whole movie? Like that's acceptable, totally acceptable, and yet if he was doing something else, it would not be acceptable, and why? So definitely there's definitely overlap with other forms of media, but games are unique in that they have this interactive uh, capacity, which kind of puts more responsibility, like you said, on the user, on the player, which means that they also are getting judged by whatever actions they are going to take. So I actually presented this to my class of students to give them this
Hmm.
dilemma and see what their responses were. To be expected, most of the responses were, violence is okay, but these other actions are not okay, and they have different reasons for it. So that was the majority of people. Some people, there were very few who were of the opinion that anything virtual is whatever. It's virtual, it's not real, anything goes. There were some people, interestingly enough, who were even against violence, or at least gratuitous violence. And I guess there must be a difference between games like PUBG or CS:GO, where you're two sides of soldiers, or well, I guess terrorists and counter-terrorists, and you shoot each other. And I wouldn't know if I call that murder because it's more like killing. But then GTA is, well, actual murder. You go around to a shopkeeper and shoot them up. So I think there is a context matters in some way. Like we can judge what is acceptable versus unacceptable based on some of the context, and makes some kind of difference. But when it comes to rape and pedophilia, it's hard to find a context where that, like you said, the gamers develop a game to reflect life and give people options, but it's hard to fit that into, something that'd be acceptable. Whereas counter-terrorists and terrorists, that, based on culture, it kind of feels more acceptable as a role to play out, even if you're playing the terrorist side.
Right. Yeah, and there is something in games where more than in other art, or more than in art generally, where I think most people tend to want to play their ideal. So, for example, like the kind of game that I know best probably is role-playing games. And most gamers that I've talked to, or people who play role-playing games, and there's variation, of course, but I think people tend overall to more often choose good characters rather than evil characters. There are these, people do evil playthroughs of a game to kind of see what it's like. But I think generally people are drawn to the more like heroic roles, to either like the lawful good character, like the knight in shining armor, or the chaotic good character, which is kind of like, in Western movies, like the Clint Eastwood version of the Western, where, kind of mysterious outsider kind of character who ends up doing good, even though maybe he's like morally ambiguous. Like people are more drawn to that type of character as an ideal than just playing like a straight ahead evil character. And so I think we often play games as kind of um, trying to bring out an ideal. And it's hard, like in that sense, violence works into that because you defeat the great evil, you defend your group, you defend your village, whatever, from aggressors, right? So it's like a justification for the violence.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you said, it's hard to, the kind of person that would see pedophilia or rape as a heroic act are not the kinds of people that we consider morally good, right? So it's hard to find a justification for that kind of ideal in a video game.
Yeah, uh so even though these my students came with some different arguments, they didn't quite solve the problem. But uh one thing was interesting that they were saying is like about the judging the quality of the person. So one of the students was saying that if you kill someone in a game, right, if you're going around killing people, it doesn't make you a murderer. But if you rape someone in a game, that more likely makes you a rapist. I mean, that was their argument. Um,
Mm,
because of the interactive element and the responsibility of the action. So, for instance, you said that many people choose the knight in shining armor to play this role. But if you're choosing a role where you're doing something bad, right? If that's your whole purpose, then it seems like it's hard to justify that from a socially acceptable point of view. But it still doesn't quite solve the problem. And I guess maybe we can try to see if we can solve the problem.
mm,
um, and I guess the first issue would be because the argument takes it as one of its implicit assumptions that violence or rape or any action online doesn't have real world consequences. That's the one of the assumptions of it. Now it's true that they did a lot of things back in the days in the 80s or 90s when these games started coming out that were violent. I think it was the Supreme Court. They made a decision. They said no, they don't see any relation between violence in the real world and virtual violence or game violence. There's no correlation. But there's been other studies. I was looking it up, and there's been other studies that say yes, okay, violence in video games doesn't lead to real world murder. Let's say killing in video games doesn't lead to real world killing, but it does have an impact on other antisocial behaviors.
mm,
So one study from 2009 showed that exposure to gratuitous violence it increased a willingness or reduced a willingness to help people in pain or walking by a homeless person and giving them money. So it has some sociological effects, even if the effect is not outright, you kill in the game, you're going to kill somebody in real life. Uh, that said, there have been other studies that show that perhaps some of these avenues of releasing violence or perhaps dark fantasies, they reduce the risk of it happening in real life. So somebody who's really angry and frustrated, they go online, they shoot a bunch of people in the game, perhaps that releases the tension that might have built up to the point where they would have gone and done it in real life. So there's a balancing act there. What do you think about that? Do you think there's a connection between what you consume virtually and what you do in real life?
I think there's a connection. Now, I would make it more from a conceptual point of view. Like all these studies, I nowadays kind of dismiss because they all, it's so hard to figure out which ones are actually well done. They all conflict with each other.
Yeah.
So I just say, I'll let the future sort it out. Um, that's kind of been my position recently on kind of the sociological, psychological, scientific studies is that, unless I'm willing to go in and really look at all the details and figure it out whether it was well done and all of that, I'm just gonna, and I don't have the time usually to. So I'm not going to deal with like what's the different studies say. Like you say, they, kind of balance each other. It's kind of a wash. Um, but I do think that the art that we consume changes how we view reality.
Hmm.
Well, experience changes experience, right? Any experience you have changes the experiences you have going forward. And I don't see why it should be any different with games. The question is what actually is the effect, and is there a different effect from playing a game like GTA versus playing a game like Tetris or Minecraft or something? Um, and that's a really difficult question. So when I think about, so I'm not sure, I don't know exactly what to do about the violence question. So in a game like GTA, there's a lot of violence, of course, but a lot of it is like over the top cartoonish stuff. But then there are also games where it's like more gritty and realistic, and GTA parts of it are fairly realistic too. But I mean, a lot of players will take it overboard, and it's just kind of like joking around at that point, and the murder is not taken really seriously. And I don't think they would treat real lives in the same way that they treat running over pedestrians in GTA, Grand Theft Auto. Um, so the violence question is really, I think, complicated, and it's going to depend on the specific game and the specific player, I think. I do think that games do teach us something about ethics, but kind of generally speaking, and about ethical behavior, but I don't know exactly what to think about the violence question. Does playing, it's almost again relates to this broader representational question. Does consuming a lot of really violent movies change how you approach the world? Now, I used to watch a lot of really violent movies. I don't really anymore. I don't watch very many movies at all anymore, but and I don't watch the kinds of movies I used to watch. So I think there may be some kind of value at some stages of your life at consuming violent media. I think teenagers are really drawn to this, or young men, maybe in their 20s. Like I used to watch a lot of horror movies, action movies, that kind of thing,
Yeah,
which
horror
doesn't
movie,
have
that's
that much attraction.
a whole nother topic there.
Yeah,
But
but it's this
okay,
question of does consuming violence or bad behavior in any media, does it change you in some way? Is it in some ways, could it be good for you? Does it
or is it good for you at
um
some parts of your life and not other parts of your life? But I guess
yeah.
like one way to see this is that there's whether we can think about it logically or not, we obviously understand right away. Well, I'm assuming because I'm not a parent, but assume right away, we understand right away based on our intuition. Like you will not, I don't, I should not putting words in your mouth, but I suppose you will not let your son play GTA. Like if he wanted to play it, you probably would say no. Actually, I don't know, maybe you wouldn't, but because there is some kind of intuition that like, what is that? Like he's not ready. Like, so when he's 20, if he wants to do it, fine, whatever. But for now, you wouldn't. And why is that? Is it because, like, what argument is it that when you're younger, you can't do it, but when you're older, you can?
Well, I think from my own experience, more as a person and also my experience as a father, like I think it takes time to get used to things. And like right now, my son is kind of getting used to the idea that the world is a dangerous place. So he's kind of entering that stage where, like, I think GTA is not, he's not ready for GTA because it's just, too much more stuff that he would see that would cause him to worry.
So it's a
And as you get
developmental
older,
issue. It's they're not ready to, they haven't been exposed to this yet. And if you dump it on them too fast, it'll have some damaging effect on their psyche or their mental development.
yeah. And
This
I
takes me to,
remember,
oh, yeah,
sorry,
sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Go ahead. So I mean, I think about when I was young, seeing bits of a movie. My father one day was watching Night of the Living Dead on TV, which is not like that terrible of a movie by today's standards. Like if you're adult watching it, like there's nothing that scary about it. It seems kind of silly in parts, but I remember this being like really scary to me when I was, I don't know, 9 or 10 or something around this age. And I would like watch glimpses of it and then run out of the room and watch like another few seconds of it and then run out of the room. And so I just wasn't ready at that time. Like you are ready at different ages of your life to experience different things. And I think generally speaking, kids are not ready to see violence, whether it's in a movie or strong kinds of violence, whether it's in a movie or a video game, until they reach a certain age of maturity where they feel like they can kind of take care of themselves in a more robust
I
way.
guess that takes us to the idea is there any level of maturity where anything virtual should be allowed? Or are there some things that society should, you know, wall off even for developed adults?
Hmm. Yeah, and I don't know exactly about this question. And it seems like it differs culturally. Like Japan, as we've maybe addressed a little bit, like in person, there's like these rape games that come out of Japan, and there have been kind of attempts to do that in the US, but they always get like they never go anywhere because
Deplatforms or
it's too extreme for consider basically too extreme. But that does seem to be like a more acceptable part of Japanese culture representations of rape, and you see this in sometimes in other countries too. Um, so I don't know exactly what that means. I don't know why that is. I think in Western culture, we've often been a bit squeamish about things like that, and about things like pedophilia and rape. And this, I've noticed this kind of just studying literature, kind of the development of literature. Like a lot of literature, kind of pre-modern literature, Western literature mentions rape. Like rape is a thing that happens, but it's almost never discussed in any detail, as opposed to other kinds of violence, which you often get, like, in the Iliad or something, you get these graphic depictions of regular violence, of people's limbs getting chopped off, of blood gushing. You get this in different epics and myths and stuff. And rape is often a part of these stories, but it's often like hinted at. It's not really described. And that seems to be like a kind of like a baked in part of Western culture in some ways. You don't really like when you start getting into Desaad and stuff in later literature in the late 18th century, these Victorian erotic novels sometimes had um, more graphic depictions of non-consensual behavior and sometimes even behavior involving children. But for a long time, that was like not something it seems like you could really do. And still today, it's like makes us squeamish. Like I think I don't know what your experience is, but often if there's a rape scene in a movie, I find that more kind of traumatic than other kinds of violence that I see in movies. And I think that works its way into how we understand games as well.
yeah, I mean, we could pivot just slightly here just to I have this other idea about because you mentioned about culture, the difference how violence and sexual violence is treated in a culture, and or not even sexual violence, it's just sex in general. So the idea of like movie ratings have always interested me because I've always found them kind of odd that PG-13 would be filled with violence and murder, killing, shooting, um, but any boob or anything immediately R rating. And I'm like, when I was growing up, I was like so confused by this because I was like, there's nothing wrong with boobs, right? But there's something wrong
Mhm.
with killing somebody. So why would a 13-year-old be allowed to spend their days watching people getting murdered, but not to see a boob? Like that was very confusing to me. Of course, it makes a little bit of sense when you think about how society is structured and how it's always, like you said, the Iliad, that it's always been kind of pro-violence or glorifying violence and always been restricting sex. I mean, the Western culture, at least, it's been sexual restriction or restrictions on sex, but glorifying violence. And there is some, I guess, adaptability to this or some cultural incentive for this or societal incentive. You need soldiers, right? If you have wars, you're going to need soldiers, and therefore you need to have at least some element of society glorifying violence in order to produce soldiers. And because for whatever reason, at least men or people are biologically wired for sex already, you don't need to do anything to encourage that behavior. You need to do something. People, I suppose, I mean, some people might just be driven biologically to murder each other. And those are the sociopath or sadist who do really well in war. But I think most people don't really want to go kill their neighbors. So you need some incentive, cultural incentive to push people to be soldiers, but you don't need any incentive to push them to go have sex with their girlfriends. Um, and so I think that's might be one of the reasons why we have this imbalance. But from a child, like from growing up point of view, and from when I like imagine what I would be like if I was a parent, I've always thought that was kind of odd that we would glorify or accept violence so easily and yet be squeamish about just normal sexuality and the human body. This is not even talking about, rape and pedophilia stuff, but there's always been this gap between violence and sex, uh, one being much more socially acceptable or and glorified. Although I see that changing, perhaps it's not a very good change. You see how OnlyFans or sex workers have, some of them are becoming glorified in a kind of like hip hop, not I don't say hip hop, but in a kind of like celebrity kind of way. I don't
Yeah.
know if that's very good for society, but I mean, you have soldiers being glorified, and yes, there's something good about it that they're defending the country, but you're also glorifying a capacity for violence, which I I, I don't know if that's so great. So what
Yeah.
do you think about that? Do you see that as an issue or not? The difference between how we see sex and violence as a society.
Yeah, I think I think there are probably historical reasons for it. I do, like you, I've been kind of perplexed by the differences in how we treat sex versus violence. Like you said, I think there have been good reasons to depict violence, to show what violence is like, to show what heroic violence is like, because we have often needed people to, communities have needed people to protect themselves from outside communities, from aggressive other communities. They've needed violence to take care of kind of bad actors within their own community. So you need sometimes to, or in the past, you've needed executions and stuff like that to get rid of people who were just out of control or violent on their own. And of course, this was, applied in problematic ways in the past, of course, and at present. But society has always needed some kind of violence. Um, Society has needed sex as well to keep itself going. But you don't get the same kind of glorification of, say, sexual pleasure that you do in the pleasure from killing someone in battle who's your enemy. And this is a weird thing maybe about Western culture. I think it's, different cultures have dealt with it in different ways. I mean, in India, where I did my PhD research, in at least ancient pre-modern literature, sex was a much bigger part. They also had these heroic epics of battles and stuff, but there was like a much bigger tradition of erotic poetry than I think you find at the same time in Europe. And maybe Japan was similar. I'm not sure. I don't know as much about Japan. I'm just always curious about why they have more extreme things are culturally acceptable, apparently. So I think different cultures have dealt with it in different ways, but I don't know why exactly. I mean, this would be an interesting question to ask someone who studies, European history or something, Western history, why there's been this taboo kind of on sexual depictions of sex and stuff. Um, so yeah,
Well,
it's
and from
something
a
I wonder about too, but
Freudian point of view, his idea is that sex needs to be constrained in order for society to flourish because the sexual drive is too powerful. Um,
yeah.
Marcuse, he had the opposite view. He was like, no, you need to release that, or you need to liberate that sexuality. Um, I don't know. Both kind of have pros and cons to it. But I can't deny obviously that I growing up watching Braveheart or some of these Troy, some of these movies, and it's like, well, of course, for most young guys, that's that the pleasure of seeing somebody, a warrior, or even like in Braveheart where he's being killed at the end, but that kind of epic, struggle, there's something very primal about that and very attractive to, at least for guys. I'm not really sure if that's totally the case for girls, but I know girls who love those movies as well. Um, but there's something about violence that's very attractive. Um, but to me, it's like I find it problematic that society would, favor one over the other. Um, and then this, I guess, brings us the idea of the connection. I guess if there is no connection, as the gamer's dilemma, the argument makes, is that they assume that there's no connection between virtual, whatever happens virtually, and whatever happens in the real world. There's no connection there, and therefore it becomes more of a dilemma, because as to say, why is violence okay, but sexual violence not okay? But we are not totally sure. There's been I know you don't trust the studies, but there's been a lot of studies about the violence and its correlation. But there's not really been much studies on sexual violence because there's no sexual violence. I mean, there are some sexual violence games, but as you said, mostly in Japan. But there haven't really been studies on that. Now, is it possible that one behavior could have less correlation and another behavior could have more correlation?
It seems possible. Again, I think it's going to be so much of a individual variation. Like another problem I have with these studies is that, you get these breakdowns like, 60% of people, we studied 60% of the people we studied, this had this outcome, 40% had this outcome. Well, I want to know like why some people had this
Oh,
outcome, why some people became more violent, say, just pretend for an example, why after playing a video game did, 60% of people have more aggression towards other, why did 40% of people have less aggression? Like what is the actual difference between those two kinds of people? What makes one person react to something one way and another kind of person react to something another way?
true. Yeah, there's so many interesting caveats to those studies. Like, were the people who became more violent or had more violent tendencies after playing violent video games, were they the people who wanted to play those games, or was it somebody who wouldn't play that game normally, but the researcher gave them the game to play, and therefore that affected them more because they didn't want to do
Hmm.
it,
Yeah.
versus somebody who plays those kind of games for fun, and then would they have less of effect? Okay, but okay, so let's assume there's no real correlation between whatever happens virtually. Although I would point out there was another game that went on Steam that was because there's CS:GO is a very old game, Counter-Strike, where you're terrorists and counter-terrorists. And even if you choose counter-terrorists, during half of the game you will be on the other side. You will switch back and forth. Um, but there is one game that was on Steam for a short time, which was a school shooter game
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
where there's like I guess I think you can play a school shooter or you could play the police, right?
Hmm.
But they took it down very quickly, even though technically it's basically the same as Counter-Strike, except
Yeah.
for the context, the location is different. And and so I guess that there is something about the context that makes a difference. And obviously, they were like, we can't sell this game because it's too politically charged.
Yeah.
Even though I don't know if I suppose GTA you could go. I don't know if there's classrooms. So there's no kids in GTA, but
Yeah.
there
Right.
are
Yeah.
there are adults. I don't know if there's any universities, but so you could do some of the same actions in other games, but if a game is devoted to this particular narrative, then it becomes unacceptable. So even violence, there are some levels or there are some contexts where the violence is not acceptable,
Hmm.
or gamers not gamers, but game developers self-censor because they realize it hits too close to home, maybe.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
maybe that hitting too close to home is one of the motivations behind the intuition separating violence and sexual violence.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Um, yeah, I do think there's something to that. Like I said, for me, just as like a media consumer, scenes of non-consensual sexual aggression, sexual violation have often been like especially traumatic to view, not only involving women, but also men. One movie that affected me a lot when I was a teenager was American History X. I don't know if you've
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
seen
that was
that, but there's
intense.
like a rape scene pretty early involving male characters. And that's like the one of the things that I remember from that movie. And so, I mean, it's the case also where women have been, where I've seen women, depictions of women being raped in movies too. That's often been like the one thing that I'll remember just because it's so like shocking or upsetting or disturbing to me. Um, I think there is, yeah, it does hit us in a different way, at least many of us, probably maybe not everyone, but like it does hit you in a different way. And I don't know exactly the reason for that because there does seem to be cultural variation, like we've said.
Yeah.
So
Well, so some of the arguments, some of the solutions that were offered, or I'm going to say like some of the possibilities that were offered to explain how our or why our intuition is different. One of them was the social acceptability theory. It's the idea that, well, because society leans towards violence and it's more acceptable, um, and not only does it lean towards violence and restrict sexuality, just normal sexuality, but it also very much is against sexual violence. And therefore, for instance, like you said, the movies nowadays compared to Night of the Living Dead, right? So Night of the Living Dead might have been really shocking back in what it was, 1980s, 1990s.
it was much early, 1960s or something, but it
Oh, really?
was,
Oh, wow. Okay, so it might have been really shocking back then for a kid to see that. But nowadays, kids are more desensitized. So I suppose it wouldn't be as traumatic of an experience for a kid nowadays. So if society is desensitized to violence because of our proclivity to violence as a culture, therefore, if we play a game that includes violence, it wouldn't affect us that much. But because society is already restricting sex and also heavily against sexual violence. If you play a game that has that, it's like a kid in the 1960s watching Night of the Living Dead. It's much more traumatic.
yeah.
That's the societal acceptance hypothesis for the gamer's dilemma, but it still doesn't quite solve the problem. It explains why, but it doesn't give us an argument as to why it should be the case. Why should sexual violence not be acceptable in a game? We understand why it is because social acceptance, but that's not an argument for why it should be.
Yeah. And I'll maybe bring in here a slightly different argument. So I don't know whether I could say absolutely that sexual violence should like never be part of a game or should not be part of a game. But one interesting wrinkle here, I think, and we could talk about whether the Japanese case disproves my thesis here, but I just don't think that's something that is very gamifiable. Like if you look at violence or war, fighting, these are things that are gamifiable. We turn them into sports, in fact, like boxing is a classic example where you've taken something that people do, commit violence, hit each other for whatever reason, and we turn that into a sport. You have rules, you have points. That's something that you can gamify in a kind of public way. We do that with war. We have war games, the kind of games like you like even. I mean, that comes out of turning war into a game. War is something that you can gamify. There's a winner, there's a loser, there's different strategies, techniques you can use to get advantages. It's very gamifiable. And I don't see how even just like consensual sex and not even to speak of like non-consensual things, sexual violations. I just don't see how you make a game out of that. Now, I know the Japanese have tried. I tend to consider that these are not really games, or at least not good games. They tend more to be like visual novels, which is more aligned to like cinema or novels, or they tend to be simulations, which is simulations like we kind of conflate them with video games, but I think they're really their own
Hmm.
separate thing. So I'm not
That's
sure
an
that
interesting
you
idea
can,
about if it can be gamified. Um,
yeah.
so there was some news recently because I think it was GTA 5. There was a hack that allows so it's simulated rape. So obviously there's no genitalia in GTA, but yeah, there's no genitalia. I think so, right? There's no genitalia. There's boobs, but anyways, okay. So the hack
Yeah,
in
sure.
GTA 5 allows users to it allows a hacker to take off their clothes and then simulate sex with another user, and that user is unable to move. It's a rape simulation. Um, and so that came out. Obviously, they tried to patch that up, but so the concept of if it can be gamified, and so there's some kind of interesting relationship between sexual violence rhetoric and gaming. And I don't know if you've ever noticed this if you don't play the games, but in the gaming culture, in the gaming world, they often use rape references
Hmm.
in the violence. So for instance, like, oh, we're totally getting raped right now, like to mean that we're losing. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. But there's some kind of they use this kind of rhetoric. And so obviously I don't play GTA because I'm not drawn to that kind of uh, random behavior, like getting chased by the cops or running people over. Um, but obviously there's I can understand the gamer's perspective of thinking it's funny
Mhm.
to go around with that hack and do that to people. I can understand the gamers who would think that's funny. Um, and and maybe this kind of I don't know what to call it, like this kind of okay, so in CS:GO, when you kill somebody, you can do something to their body. You can like spray paint them or something, like
Mhm.
humiliate them, right? Uh,
Right.
that's not really a core feature of the game. That's just like some extra thing you can do. Um, so that humiliation is probably what is going through the minds of the people who are using that hack to go in GTA and do that to other people. It's the humiliation, degradation aspect that's gamified. Now, that of course makes it even worse. And on top of killing somebody, you're humiliating them. But that does show how it's possible that you can gamify some of those elements that you're saying in those non-consensual interactions. And oh, I'm not sure exactly how you would gamify that, but I understand the impulsivity towards that. You want to humiliate the other side and then gain some kind of points for your humiliation. Um, but so I have another issue with this this argument. So we have this gamer's dilemma, and we still haven't solved it. We explained why it's there. We explained why society has or why we have these intuitions, but we haven't explained why that should be the case. Why should we have these intuitions? Um, and another argument for these intuitions is the idea of the gamer psychology or personality. Is there a difference between um, wanting to, hang out with your friends and shoot each other in the head in a game versus, you know, going on a game and raping each other? Like there's some, it seems to be that there's some kind of psychological difference there.
Yeah.
And
And
one thing makes us more uncomfortable than the other. Like if someone says they did that, we would look at them be in a different way because the psychology it takes to do one action versus the psychology it takes to do another action. There's something different about the psychology behind it.
yeah, and I think you said something important when you used the word humiliation and talked about that in was it CTO or whatever? Whatever
CSGO,
one of
yeah.
the yeah, yeah, CSO, sorry. Uh but yeah, I think the concept of humiliation is maybe interesting to expand on here. And it certainly, I think, applies to multiplayer games. I don't know exactly if this applies in the same way to single player games,
Hmm.
but there's this question of whether there's some kind of extra part of the idea of the gamer's dilemma is whether there is some kind of external morality that applies within games, or do games just have their own morality, and you leave real world morality behind when you enter into the game. And I think something about morality kind of external to the game enters into the game, and we capture this, I think, with words like sportsmanship, like having good sportsmanship or sportspersonship, or maybe gamesmanship or gamespersonship in this case, where you don't really, the object is not really to humiliate the other person, right? You're trying to have a good game. You're supposed to show respect to each other as players, because you want to continue the game, right?
Yeah.
The game is not just like a one-off thing. You totally destroy the other person, you humiliate them beyond repair, and then they never want to play again, right? That's not the ideal outcome for a game. So we have this idea of sportsmanship, good sportsmanship. And so I think a little bit of that comes in here. Like rape is a way to humiliate another person, like gain sort of absolute control, exert absolute control over another person. It's a kind of humiliation. I think people, you have these feelings of shame, I imagine, based on, hearing about experiences of this. Like you have these experience of humiliation. It's a kind of like a game ender, right? Like there's no playing after that. And I think there's a little bit of that comes in, even if it was like a one-person game. And there is like an example of this, maybe not a great example, but there's with this really old game called Custer's Revenge,
Hmm.
which this was for the Atari, so it was like way back in the early 80s. And you played as Colonel Custer, and you're like on one side of the screen and you're basically naked, and there's a naked woman tied to a pole on the other side of the screen. And basically the object of the game is to get from one side of the screen to the other side of the screen to have sex with this woman who's tied to a pole while there's arrows being shot at you and stuff. That's basically the game.
Just in
Now,
1980s.
yeah. And I think the game developers did not see this, like their kind of argument to the public was that this was not rape, like she's seducing him. It seems like, absolutely ridiculous. But maybe there's some ambiguity about what's going on. But even in a one-person game like that, if we accept that, if we make the argument that this is actually rape that's occurring, which seems like it would be the case, there does seem to come to be this element of like humiliation that's brought into the game, where it's not just like you're trying to succeed by dodging all the arrows and whatever, but you're also doing this kind of like unsportsman like act, where it's it's a person who's
Yeah,
tied up.
that's quite interesting because you mentioned before about how there's a lot of overlap between what like some things that we call games aren't really games. They're more like simulations or
Yeah,
more
yeah,
like
yeah.
you said, art or comic or other vision. So I never played that game, and so it was a
Played it.
Western game. It was like sold in
Yeah,
the
it wasn't.
West.
I think American, or I forget. The publisher was either European or American. I forget. I think it was like actually a Swedish company, but it was sold in America at least for like a
So
short time.
I can understand or I can see how that game could have been uh like passed like didn't just stir up too much like
Oh, it was controversial.
it was controversial, but I suppose it must have been like out enough for people to buy it and play it.
Yeah, yeah,
Because I think that's overlapping with like porn and game. It's like gamified porn. I think
yeah,
that might have been uh more of the underlying impetus for that game from
yeah.
the
It was. I
user's
think.
point of view, I suppose.
I think actually the developers, that was their intention, was to bring porn into games. Now, if you look at it, it's totally I mean, these
Yeah, I
blocky
imagine 1980s
1980s.
graphics wouldn't have been anything to write home about,
No.
but it's yeah, so it's interesting. It's a problematic when we fit all these different aspects or into what we call a game when it's not really a game, when it's not But the idea of humiliation as being a game, um, I don't know. Like it's been an issue for the last number of years of toxic gamers. So all these game companies had a real issue because toxic gamers make other gamers, not want to play, so they get lose revenue. Um, so like if you are too toxic, you get banned from different game platforms. And of course, some in the chat they are you're not able to type certain like bad words. It gets like blurred out. Um, so the idea that there is some kind of outside morality affecting the game. So you want to play this game, you want to shoot each other, but you don't want to be too toxic.
Right.
But at the same time, you want to have some element of competition or some element of. So I think humiliation plays a little bit of a role,
Yeah.
because you get humiliated in one round, then you get angry and you want to like pay back and fight harder the next round. So there is some kind of place for that. Whether it can become itself a game mechanic, I'm not totally sure. But is it possible that we have a solution for this game dilemma? Do you have any way of explaining it to justify why we have these intuitions?
Again, I don't really have like a really satisfactory solution, but I would look at like what we think is okay to what we're comfortable consuming, what representations more broadly we're comfortable consuming, and what kinds of representations we're not comfortable consuming. And I think most of us, because of kind of cultural, historical, perhaps ultimately partly evolutionary reasons, are not comfortable consuming very many graphic depictions of rape or child abuse or things like that. Whereas for a variety of reasons, some of which we've talked about, like we're more comfortable consuming violence. So I think it's not, I still don't think it's, I mean, I know there's some distinct things about games. There's more like player agency and stuff. Um, but again, I just have to refer to like the broader cultural, historical issues surrounding like
Yeah.
what we feel comfortable representing and what we don't feel comfortable representing.
So would you be more on the side of the social hypothesis, the idea that because something is more culturally acceptable, that trickles down to stuff like games, and our intuitions come from what is socially acceptable 50 or 100 years from now, that might be different. Therefore, games will be different. Uh, so that's kind of a relativistic point of view. Or is there, obviously, there are people who are, more of a realist or absolutist when it comes to morality, that there is some kind of universal morality, and everywhere and for every culture, there is some things that are acceptable and some things that are not acceptable. And even if 100 years from now society changes, it will still be either acceptable or unacceptable based on this objective external morality. Or are you in the position that there is a clear distinction between real life and depictions and game or other kinds of depictions of or simulations of life?
Well, I kind of probably combine some of
Hmm.
those positions you've talked about. I do think there is a separation between games and life and art and life. I think that's why um, we mark that, we make that explicit, like when we put a frame around a picture, we say this is a separate thing.
Oh,
Now, this is
okay.
to be enjoyed for its own sake. It's not, it doesn't have like an end external to it. It's like marked off from the rest of the world, right? And games are like that. Huizinga, however you say his name, talks about the magic circle. That's another way of kind of saying the same thing, but in the context of games. So I think there is this separation. But again, when games become representational, that breaks it a little bit in that certain representations are acceptable and some are not. And I do think there is some universality among all humans. Humans are humans and they share some things in common. What those are has been hard to figure out exactly. I mean, anthropologists have been arguing about this for more than 100 years. And but obviously, I think uh, communities of humans who grow and develop in different locations, different environments, develop cultural differences that also work into this. So I do have like partly relativist and partly I do think there is a universal thing. Figuring out what those are is really, really hard to do. Um, so that doesn't really exactly answer the gamer's dilemma, but that's where I come out on those different positions. I mean, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I have a problem trying to figure out exactly what the logical reason is for these different intuitions, um, or what the argument can what kind of argument can be made to justify the moral intuitions. Um, because the main argument we have is the no harm principle. So violence is bad, and real life violence is bad, and real life rape is bad because somebody is being hurt. Um, so
Well,
that's the kind. It's what?
except sometimes violence can be good, like in
Well, no. Well, I mean, yeah, that's true. Okay, so yeah, well, I'll take that back. Sometimes you want somebody to be hurt if you're a soldier and the enemy is invading you. Um, so there are exceptions to the no harm principle. But I mean, whenever anything that we call morality, there's some victim, right? So that's the idea of victimless crimes, like weed should be legal or drugs should be legal because there's no victim. Of course, then the other argument is, well, maybe you are the victim because it damages your brain or whatever. But if our morality seems to be based on a concept of harm, of no harm, and therefore everything that we do, there must be some victim. Even if you don't pay taxes, well, the victim's not really the government. The victim is uh, people the government can't help because you
right.
didn't give the money. So that's a theory. Of course, in real life, there are the government will have other explanations for why they should punish you, even if there's no one being hurt. But morally speaking, we have this is our fundamental argument or fundamental position is that something is bad because somebody is being hurt. And a video game, no one, again, we are assuming that there is no correlation between virtual world and real world, that shooting someone in a video game is not going to make you shoot someone in real life. If we take that assumption, which may or may not be the case, it might not make you kill somebody, but it might make you be more mean or something. But if we take the assumption that there is no correlation, there's no one being hurt, there's no victim, then what argument do we have to say that anything is impermissible or is unacceptable? Now, same issue with drugs. Like there's no external victim, but perhaps the person being victimized is you. And maybe just because we don't understand what some of these drugs do. And maybe 50 years ago, we find out, oh, smoking weed makes you get Alzheimer's or something. I don't think that's the case. But if that's the case, then we would say, oh, I am the victim, even though I don't know it yet. Now, could we say that too about something like violence? We say, okay, playing violent video games there's no one being harmed, but maybe 50 years from now, we learn that actually playing violent video games makes me more desensitized to something that I would consider a harm. So I'm harming myself. So we are in a position of lack of knowledge. We have a limited knowledge, limited understanding of these impacts. And therefore we're trying to build a morality, even though we don't have the full knowledge. But what we have so far is the idea of harm. And I don't know if there is another idea besides that, another logical argument to make. Have you heard of anything, or do you think of anything else besides this harm principle?
For morality
Yeah.
specifically.
Is there any
Um,
moral actions that don't involve that are immoral but don't involve a victim?
Immoral that don't involve the victim. I don't know. I don't think so. I do like what you say about self harm, and I think that's an important thing to draw out, even if there's even if a person doesn't go on to commit acts of violence or whatever. I do think there is something to that. I mean, this has been a tricky argument philosophically. I think this, Aristotle talks about this kind of thing as a basis of ethics, that when you um, do something bad, you're not just potentially harming other people, but you're harming your own virtue, right? You're harming
Yeah.
yourself. You're making yourself a less kind of virtuous person, which is his own kind of bad, morally bad thing. And I do think that can be an issue in games, and can in perhaps be a way used that we use to differentiate good games from bad games. The game designer Jonathan Blow has this question for kind of ethical game design where he asks, does a game make you a better player? Like, do you feel like a better person after you
Hmm.
play a game than you did before, or do you feel like a worse person after you play?
Oh, interesting.
Does the game make you into a worse person? And this is an interesting question to think about. I mean, it gets a little bit into what we think games can actually do for us. So there's the question of like what games, like all the empirical things that happen in the world because we play games. But then there's the question of like, what do we think games can and should, like, what is the ideal that we think games can do for us?
Hmm.
And maybe I'll briefly lay out what I think like a good game can do for you. Because like I've written before, you mentioned this earlier, I do think games are important. So why are games important? And maybe like circling around in this way, it might illuminate some reasons of why certain representations in games are maybe not that good of a thing. Um, so I think games teach you about system. This is also kind of a Jonathan Blow idea, but I think games teach you about systems and consequences, and that if you do one thing, other things become possible. If you do something else, different things become possible. It basically teaches you kind of like foresight, looking at thinking very carefully about the consequences of actions, right? When you play a game, or when you play a good game at least, and you want to progress in that game, you want to win that game, you have to think carefully about each thing that you do. Is this going to help me progress? What happens if I do this? What various things might happen if I do this? Even like playing, especially like playing a game of chess, right? You always are having to think ahead. Like if I do this, what might the other person do? And I think playing games gets us to kind of embody those processes that seem like very abstract and intellectual. It makes us really think carefully in a way that we care about the consequences of our actions. And I think this is the kind of thing that good games can teach us. Now, I don't know, you can say what you think about that, but I do think that there's maybe representations of perhaps extreme violence or sexual violence in games that would probably work against that, maybe. But what do you think
Yeah.
maybe about that premise?
I
And
think
I
there's
don't know.
also an issue again with distinguishing games from other kinds of media slash entertainment. So like GTA for me, of course it's a game, but it's not a game in the sense of like you play a sport and there's two sides and there's points and there's a goal. Whereas GTA feels more like I don't know exactly what the name for those kind of games where you're just there is no goal to the game, you're just playing. Like No
Mhm.
Man's Sky, also you just go through the universe and check out some different planets. So there's no point system. There's no so it's and so what is that a different kind of game or is that something else? Is that some kind of just experiential? It's like a simulation. Um, some of these games, like Flight Simulator, is that a simulation or is that a game? It's hard to make a distinction. So some things for me for GTA and some of these game style simulators, it's more of a simulation to me rather than an actual game. Um,
Mhm.
so I guess I'm coming a little bit from a little bit different point of view to understand what a game is. So to me, what a game is distinguished between game and real life. There's some kind of chasm between these two concepts. And um, like if you say, oh, don't worry, it's just a game. This is the idea that whatever the game is, it's a different metaphysical reality than what we call life. And a game is also can be distinguished as a formalized play. Like there's a concept of play, and then there's like a formalization. The more formalized it is, the more game-like it is. And maybe that's a difference between GTA and some of these games actually have scores and goals.
Mm,
As a GTA is more like play. You're just playing
mm,
around. Um, but there are some features we have for games. We have, at least for formalized games, there's end goals, there's some kind of rules, must be an interactive quality, or else it's not a game. And your interactive quality must be able to affect the outcome. There must be, like you said, you do something and some other choices happen. And I think something else is really interesting and really important is consent. I think what a fundamental feature of a game is consent. And this comes back to the idea of good and bad games. Um, so you were mentioning that there's some of these games or some of these elements in a game format would make it a bad game. Or like you said, the researcher who says that it make you feel worse afterwards, well, that's an example of a bad game. Um, so so for instance, something like the movie Saw,
mm.
I actually never watched a full movie, full any of those. I think there's like 4 or 5 of them, but they play some kind of games inside, right? So
Right, yeah,
technically, those are games in a technical, I mean, in some kind of sense, but they're not consensual. So that'd be if that is a game, it's a bad game because
right.
you're taking out some elements, and the main element you're taking out is consent. Also, like the movie Escape Room was similar to that, or Squid Games. Um,
Mm,
Squid Game's a little bit more tricky because yes, they're literally playing games, but something about the difference between a game and real life, one of the I guess the assumptions is that the um the the result of the game, or what happens at the end is the cost is too high. So real life, you have real life costs. You do something, you fall down, you're going to get hurt. Like these are real life consequences. But what makes a game different from real life is that the consequences are not as high. And therefore, if you have something like Squid Games where the consequences are too high, it's no longer a game.
yeah,
Um, and so I think these features are what make a game a game. And there's some kind of underlying metaphysical separation between game and life, or the concept of game and life. Um, but focusing on these ideas of consent, um, and the outcome, um, I'm not sure how that would work. Like using the idea of consent, we can say, okay, well, some like rape themed games, wouldn't be a good game. That's good and bad, because then lacking the element of consent. But then what if two parties both consented to play each, opposite roles? Would that make that morally acceptable or not? So again, back to the dilemma, but I guess we're getting more narrow because we're cutting out some other possibilities. So something uh, where you allow features in the game that strip you of consent or strip you of being able to affect the outcome or raise the stakes too high, as in like Squid Games, those things will be bad games. But now we have a more narrow definition. If you have anything in the virtual world, as long as it is connected to these features, could be acceptable or could be called a good game.
yeah. Um, right. So I think the question of kind of these open world games is interesting. I do think they're actually often two different things. Maybe just to start with that idea. Um, I think I know maybe more Minecraft a little better because that's one my son plays, where there's like a creative mode, which is basically like a version of digital play. I would call that play. And maybe kind of the open world aspect of GTA is like that. Or I don't know what, I think they have different modes too. I've never played GTA either. But I think they have like a story mode and then a kind of a free play
Oh,
mode. And I think those are different things, right? The one is play, like creative mode in Minecraft is play, because there's no goal. You're just doing it for the enjoyment of doing it, right? And but then there's also survival mode, where you have actually things that you want to achieve. There is actually kind of a goal there and more rules and stuff. So there's more more restrictions on what you can do. Um, that's properly a game. So I think a lot of these games are actually sometimes multiple things. Actually, some of the older RPGs that I play, like they've released new versions where um, there's not only like kind of the regular thing, but there's like a story mode where the game kind of takes care of all the actually game parts for you. So you can just enjoy the story. And then it becomes actually more like a digital novel or visual novel.
Okay.
So games, like what we call games, can sometimes be many different things in one and the same package, right? Depending on which mode you play it in, it might just be play, it might be a novel, it might be a actual game. So that kind of complexity is there that we kind of slide between these things. We all put it under the umbrella of game, but actually it's many different things. And consent, I'm not sure what I want to add, but I think consent is an important thing. You mentioned the idea of like two kind of real life people entering into a game where like one is like a rapist and one is a rape victim. Um, that to me seems, we sometimes call that sort of a thing like game, like we talk about sex games or role playing in sex and stuff. Um, but that seems to me more like along the lines of a simulation.
Yeah, I guess it goes back to the issue of how do you gamify some of these actions that wouldn't immediately have a gamified concept to it. Although it takes us back to, like you were saying, Huizinga, and his one of his arguments for games is that society is structured as a game. A lot of things in society, war is game-like. A lot of things, we call it the rat race. A lot of things in society have game mechanics to it. And if you talk about psychology too, there's a lot of there's children play games or play in order to develop models of the world. So our earliest models of reality are game-based. And therefore, when we develop, we create societal structures that are also game-based or also have game mechanics. And then when it comes to the sexual world, there's also a lot of games. I mean, not even just the sexual world, but in the world of human interaction. There's a book from some psychologist called Games People Play. Every day we're playing games. Our interactions with other people is a kind of game. And then specifically when it comes to sexual behavior, sexual interaction, like you flirting, that's also a kind of game, sexual attraction, there's all games. And I guess, it's obvious to see it when you see animals, with their peacocks and their feathers and their other birds collecting rocks or, it's all, there's a game-like element to it. But so I guess there would be two different distinctions between in the gamer's dilemma. One of them is sexuality, like sexualizing games. Nothing to do with non-consensual stuff, but it's just the sexualizing of games. And then there is the non-consensual or non-acceptable like sexual abuse elements of games. That that one is harder to I mean, we have this intuition against it, and the only defense we have is a harm principle. If no one's being harmed, then how can we say that's not acceptable? But if we understand it, as you said, through the idea that does a game leave you feeling better, or like is it a good game versus a bad game? And if you have the idea of consent being embedded in there, at least we're coming away with more of a narrowed version of the gamer's dilemma. So the dilemma is becoming smaller as we speak, hopefully. Um,
Yeah.
and, but the idea of having a good game versus a bad game is quite interesting. I don't know if that would solve the gamer's, like if we say, oh, that's a bad game, does that solve the gamer's dilemma? I guess we still want to know. I guess we have an argument as to why it's a bad game. But then I guess it just takes us back to the purpose of a game. Like, what is the reason? Obviously, entertainment. What is the biological drive for entertainment? Is it stress reduction, something like this? Then we have education by simulation. So a lot of games, real life games or virtual games, are educational, at least in the sense, like you said, that you simulate something and then you have to make choices and decisions, and your choices and decisions have consequences, and so it's definitely a educational process. Entertaining, but it's educational. And then you also sent me that YouTube video about, I forgot what the name of the game was, but the argument was that games have a therapeutic, or could have a therapeutic element. It's people read novels and watch movies, and they help them process different things that happen in their life. Well, games also, and might even do that even more effectively because you are engaged in the process. Yeah, so there's definitely, and I guess just like reading books too, there's the spiritual awakening. A lot of people create content or media for the purpose of helping people awaken or realize something, and I suppose games could have the same effect too. So I guess having the concept of the purpose of a game gives us at least some idea of what makes a game good or what makes a game bad, or what makes games good or bad. And along with the other elements of, consent and interactivity. Doesn't quite totally solve the problem, but it's getting us closer.
Yeah, I do feel like I like a lot of where you're going. Um, yeah, so many things, but I just want to mention, so you mentioned a game that I sent you a video about, just to let people know what we're talking about here is a game I sent Daniel a video about, the game Lisa the Painful. There's a series, I think there's 3 games, but the main one is called Lisa the Painful. And I actually have mixed, I mean, I have maybe a slightly different view of it now that I've kind of explored that game a little bit more. I think that it can have a therapeutic, I mean, people are really emotionally impacted by that game, I think rightfully so. But I tend to think that my thinking about it now is that they're impacted by it because it has these literary elements into it. So actually, I mean, we maybe don't want to get too much into the details here, but I'll maybe leave that for now, that it has a very strong artistic or literary element to it where you can't always make choices. And the fact that you can't make choices in games, they sometimes call that railroading, where you don't let the player do certain things. And that actually leads to these really emotional scenes more than the actual game mechanics where you do choose. Anyway, leaving that aside, um, I do think the good game bad thing here is really important, because it's hard for me to see how you could make a good game in kind of the Jonathan Blow sense that I'm taking over here, of a game that makes you into a better person, makes you into a more thoughtful or forward-thinking kind of person, aware of the consequences of your action. It's hard for me to see how you could make a game like that that has a kind of sexual abuse mechanic. Like, I just don't see how that happens. Maybe it's possible, and
Yeah,
I
but
would hold.
even with his argument, like it still doesn't tell us whether that is an objective morality or a relative morality. So if the game leaves you feeling bad, is it leaving you feeling bad because society, or because it is objectively a bad game? And when me and you are saying the word good and bad, we don't mean the layman's term of good and bad. We mean something to do with the metaphysically bad and metaphysically good. The game is, so maybe bad, good and bad is not the right word,
Yeah,
or it's a confusing word. It's more like effective versus ineffective game, or
yeah.
authentic versus inauthentic. Maybe that's a better one.
Mhm.
So is is the game, does a game leave us feeling good because it is, so let's say we go and shoot a bunch of people in the game and we feel good, or we don't feel bad because society is accepting of the violence. Now, does that mean that the violence is okay and just society is twisted? Sorry, does that mean does that mean the violence is actually objectively okay? Or does that mean that society is just twisted and therefore we don't feel bad about it because we live in a society? So the argument can be applied to other behaviors in games. So it's still, it does give us, it does bring us closer, but it doesn't tell us whether that's objective or societal.
Well, let's focus on just like regular violence, like a war kind of game, fighting game, something like that. As I said before, I think fighting, war, they lend themselves to gamification, as maybe although we might not like the idea of violence, like violence, kind of fighting type violence does lend itself to gamification, whether you like it or not. So the question is, like, if you play that kind of game, like PUBG or Doom or any of these kind of violent games, when does it turn you in? When does that experience make you into a better person? When does it make you into a worse person? It's not so much like sometimes we say feel, does it make you feel good or feel bad? That's not exactly what I want to say, but does it make you into a better person? And I think this question of does it make you think more carefully about the consequences of actions? If it makes you think more carefully, understand more carefully the consequences of actions, develop tools for foresight, for understanding complex systems, I think it is a good game, whether, despite or, irregardless is not a real word, but regardless of its violent imagery. So I think, we can have violence in art. That's always been a big part of art. The question is, what kind of person does the experience of that art make you into? Um, and I think a good game and good art will make you into a better person, even though it might have some bad things. And there's this quote from Suzanne Langer I sometimes go back to, which is that beautiful works, he's talking about art here, but beautiful works may contain elements that, taken in isolation, are hideous. So you can have these bad elements, you can have this blood and gore, whatever, and it can still be a good game. The question is whether you could have, the gamer's dilemma for me then comes down to whether you could have sexual violence or violence against children in a game and still have it be a good game in that sense, or does that kind of overwhelm the redeeming properties of the game?
Hmm.
And I
That's
think
interesting.
for
I
most
guess the reason why they took, according to one video I was watching, the reason why they took children out of GTA, or the reason why they don't have children in GTA, not, well, I mean, the argument they were making is not really because they were so moralistic. It's more like if they had children there, they would get an adult rating, and they wanted to sell more video games. They took children out, but there is some, like, that's a whole nother thing too. That's nothing to do with sexuality or nothing to do with sexual violence. It's something to do with just violence against children versus violence against adults. So GTA, you can't kill any kid. I think there's one kid, but they can't kill him. So you can kill a bunch of other people, but you can't kill kids. And there's some kind of intuition that tells us it's something worse about killing a kid versus killing an adult, or something worse about depicting it. But that's a whole nother issue there. Like, why is that? There was other people who were they started a petition because in GTA you can kill a prostitute, and they're saying like the class of prostitutes, they're already victimized, so they shouldn't allow this, just like they don't allow children to be killed. But then the arguments against that, where are you going to draw the line? Old people, you can kill old people in GTA apparently. So should you not? They're also like a marginalized class. Like, what if you went around and only killed black people or white people or I don't know how many different types of people? I suppose you could just, I don't know if there's Jews in the game. Like, at what point would you say, this group is marginalized and therefore it shouldn't be represented in a violent game? That's a whole other argument too. And why we draw the line at children and adults, we don't draw the line at old people or something. So that's a whole other discussion, which is quite interesting. But back to the idea of does it make you better? That's quite interesting because, so I guess a lot of that has to do with the psychology of the player. So for me, when I go and shoot my friends in some of these games, the psychology behind it is so you need the death, you need to be killed or kill somebody in order to make the game to raise the stakes, right? You need to have some stakes in there. So just like, playing a game where you get a point, it's not that exciting. But if you play a game where the consequences die, obviously you're not dying in real life, which would make it a bad game. But if the consequences live or die, then it becomes much more intense, right? It makes an intense element to it. But the psychology behind it is you, because of your actions, because of what you do, can determine whether you live or die. And that is a fascinating, empowering element. And that's what's most attractive in playing this game is that you have this capability for determining the outcome. And even though I'm never going to be in a computer game, and maybe I will never be in a situation of war, but it can be applied to other situations where under pressure, being able to make decisions that
Right.
have consequences. And that is what makes it fascinating to me. So
Right.
I'm not playing it from a perspective of like, oh yeah, it's fun to go in GTA and mow people over with my car because I take pleasure out of hurting others. Like, so, but if that was like my psychology, if my psychology is I like to play these shooting games because I'd like to see them suffer, that might be problematic. And that, so even the game itself doesn't change, my interaction, my relationship with the game would produce a different kind of outcome. And therefore, after the game, whether it makes me good or better, would have some impact. So I don't know, again, whether we can't take the game in isolation. We have to take the game and the gamer and their relationship into deciding whether some of these games have the ability to be good or bad, or authentic or inauthentic. And so is it possible if we could draw a line between violence and sexual violence? Violence can be, there are some cases where violence will not make you a better person in a game, but there are some cases where violence could make you a better person in a game. Is there any instances where sexual violence can make you a better person in a game? And I think that is also something to do with the psychology behind it. So when you play a non-sexualized game versus a sexualized game, I think there's a different intentionality, kind of like watching a movie versus watching porn. There's a different intentionality behind it. Does that make it not a game? Like, does that take it out of the context of game when it becomes sexualized? When it becomes a different element? Like, does it take it out of the realm of art when it becomes pornified? So this is an interesting distinction as well. And therefore, if it's sexualized, does it become more of a simulation versus a game? And does it then have different rules, whether we can't really determine whether it's a good or bad based on the effect? We have to determine it based on something else.
Yeah, you said a lot of really good things there, really important things. Just maybe to respond to a couple of them. Um, I think, I mean, the position I'm coming to through this conversation is that probably for, at least for most Westerners, having like really sexualized content in a game, and especially having like rape scenes or rape mechanics in a game is like is going to overwhelm like the positive benefits that is going to come from the game for most people. Like I think it's just too distracting, it's just too disturbing. For whatever historical reasons, we're not as comfortable with that stuff as we are with more like warlike violence. So I think that's just going to overwhelm like the positives of the game, even if from some other perspective it's a well-designed game or whatever. And I think like dealing with sexual content as well, you get into the issue of um, pornography, which I think is something different from art. Again, it's this interaction you talk about. It's not just like one thing or the other. It's how you use it, what you're getting out of it. And I think games with sexual content, we use them more. Well, but people use them probably more. I don't know, but I would imagine that it's more for the purposes of sexual stimulation. Genital stimulation is the goal, right? The sexual gratification of the player is the goal. Ultimately, I don't know exactly how people use these games, But I would suspect that, looking at sexual imagery is you're no longer like enjoying the game as a game, or if it's a piece of art, you're no longer enjoying the art as an experience in itself. You have this ulterior motive, which is your own sexual gratification. So again, that's going to be like a kind of person dependent thing. It's this interaction that you mentioned,
So
but that would be,
it's more like gamified porn. It's porn that has
yeah,
been adding game mechanics to it.
yeah,
So I guess that falls into a different category altogether because of
yeah, yeah,
the intention. Huh. Huh.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it definitely cuts down the gamer's dilemma then, because then we're like, it's not really a gamer's dilemma if it's porn, because that's, well, not a gamer's issue.
yeah,
Well, I mean, I there's still there's one other thing I wanted to mention about this too is, uh, I'd say I never been in war, so I don't know. But generally speaking, if you play these shooting games, there's no you're not triggered. Like there's nothing like I don't suppose anybody comes away feeling like psychologically unraveled because now I don't know what it'd be like, but if I was in war and I saw my buddy get shot in the head, and then I try to go play these games where I'm shooting my friends in the head, that might I might have some issue that might be it might be triggering. It might evoke a psychological breakdown. Um,
yeah,
Now, but rape is a little bit different because um, even if it's I guess hitting too close to home. So when you go around on the game and you shoot each other, it's kind of distant from life. Uh, it doesn't it doesn't feel close enough to be real. But if there was a sexual abuse element, it seems closer, like seems like it more. But then again, I'm not really totally sure. So yeah, I guess in the US, there's a lot of gun violence. So maybe gun violence is closer to home. Um, sounds bad, but so, it seems to me that if you have a game of violence, you'll have very few people who will be triggered by it. But if you have a game of sexual violence, you potentially will trigger a lot of people because it hits closer to home. And maybe that's one
yeah,
argument against it.
yeah, yeah. I think it does. Sexual violence does feel like more personal. I'm sure if I had been in a war or been in a school shooting, I would have a very different
Hmm.
view
Yeah.
of other kinds of gun violence in video games or other kinds of violence in video games. Um, but yeah, it does feel more distant for us. So again, I think it's kind of a personal, there is a lot of personal stuff there and cultural stuff that, it's always that interaction. Like the game provides you with a thing you can interact with, but how the results of that interaction are always going to be partly dependent on the person and the context and all of that, the history and everything. So
All right, well, it seems like we really narrowed down this gamer's dilemma. Might not have solved it completely, but definitely made some progress. Um,
yeah.
I was
Yeah.
thinking like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just think I do think my position so far is that there are just some things that are like there's good games and there's bad games and there's certain things, certain imagery that is just going to take a good game and turn it into a bad game basically by overwhelming the good parts of it. And so I think and I think
Yeah,
there's a lot of
I
reasons
have a
that
similar
goes into,
view.
yeah,
I would also add to it that there are elements of it that are not like we need to make a distinction between games and gamified something else, gamified porn or gamified anything else,
yeah,
gamified art, uh, gamified, comic books. So, it still breaks it down into more bite size, and then like, well, the other argument will be, okay, so what about gamified porn? What is acceptable or not acceptable in that arena? And so it gives us more of a handle on the gamer's dilemma. Still, we're not entirely sure whether it is uh, if the intuition itself is driven by an objective or societal motivation for what is acceptable or unacceptable. And this takes us, I just like to close up, point out the idea of these different thinkers and how they thought about games versus games and society. Again, back to the idea there's a distinction between games and reality. We have this inbuilt distinction. So even a child knows that they're playing, and then there's play time, and then there's real life time, whatever. So there's this kind of distinction that we know. But then we have society that is kind of structured like a game, and our sense of the world is structured like a game, and how we interact is structured like a game. And when we talk about the good and bad games, we can also apply that to society. These structures that we built, can we call them good or bad structures, good or bad games? Or like the games that we are playing psychologically with people, with their, husbands, wives, children, the games that we're playing, are they good or bad games? Games that we play in society as a society, are they good or bad games? This idea of the rat race, for instance, that would be it's presented as a bad game. So we have this idea that there is these structures in society and structures in psychology and human behavior that are game-like, and that there is something that makes a game good or bad. And I think this is because where I come from is this more of a metaphysical point of view, and it's something related to this spirituality or metaphysical element of this attitude towards life. And there have been numerous thinkers or mystics who have talked about how adopting a playful or an attitude towards life that is more open to play, and treat it in essence treating it more as a game versus treating it as too seriously. There's that element too. And one thing I think for me is quite interesting is what makes a game good, this idea of consent or its interactivity, and therefore that's what also makes a society what's good or bad, a good or bad society, or a good or bad reality, is this idea of consent. And that's why, to me, games go like much further down than just virtual games or sports games, that it subsumes in every level of society and reality. And that's what my attraction to game theory is, because I think it goes all the way down. And I think if we figure out the roots of this, that might help us to solve some of the surface level gamers' dilemmas, where what makes a good game, or what makes good art, or what makes good, or what is acceptable or unacceptable to represent in media. I think a lot of that's underlied by these different theories.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm wondering, what is your perspective, like a metaphysical perspective of games and reality and society? How do you see all that?
Yeah. So I think there's kind of I do think there are definitely parallels between games and other kinds of social things. And I do think there's a feedback that goes on. So games come out of social experience or social structures, right? And then once you have games, that feeds back into how we organize and think about these social structures. But I still want to keep clear a distinction between games and society, or games and life, games and even institutions. I think institutions are really interesting because they're very similar to games. Like you have an institution is basically a rule for getting something done. It's generally a practical thing, like getting food, distributing goods, keeping a currency in circulation, whatever. We have institutions to do these things, which are kind of rules set up to do this, which is very similar to a game where you have rules and you have a kind of goal. Like each game has a goal. Basically, each social institution has a goal. And then you have the actual games that are the outcome of these rules, and you have kind of social organizations, social interactions, which are the outcome of these institutions. So there's a very strong parallel here, and they probably come out of like a similar place. And like I said, like once they get started, then they feed back into how we understand things and how we do things going forward. I do want to keep a like I would want to keep a distinction between like I said, between games and other things. So I don't want to see life in general as a game or in general as a kind of play. Um, I don't know. I think the play thing is actually maybe a little more complicated depending on how you define play. I could see understanding life as a kind of play if you're kind of thinking of play as Dewey thinks about it, where it's a kind of this a means that the end is the means itself, where it's like this thing that you do because it's enjoyable to do, so you want to keep doing it. I mean, it would be nice if life were like that, where it's something you want to keep engaging with because it's pleasurable to do so, and it just makes you want to keep doing it. And that's kind of a definition of play. Of course, play is distinct for someone like Dewey from practical activities, because you do also need to create stuff to survive. You need to acquire food and other things, shelter and all of that, which would not necessarily be considered play. It would be considered more a kind of work, which in Dewey is not opposed to play, but it's kind of like play where there's a definite end, where you're making a material change to the world. So I think, yeah, I do think there's a lot there to explore. I guess I don't want to, I guess my brain's getting tired. I don't want to go into too much more in this direction, but I do think there's a lot to explore there. Maybe in a future conversation about the relationships of play and games and life and reality, and how all those things kind of fit together and inform each other. And
Yeah, there's definitely a lot that can be said about that, and a lot to be said about the distinctions between, our attitudes towards life, whether we have, Dewey's version of play, which might be a little bit different than, the mystic's version of play, was like, the universe playing hide and seek with itself. We come to experience this, and we choose to forget that we are part of the whole thing, and therefore we get to have this experience. That's a more of a metaphysical / spiritual interpretation of game and play. But there are also, I guess, negative elements to the cons, like just as there is bad games or inauthentic games, there are negative aspects to society that are game-like. So as game mechanics, or I guess as we are become more aware of the game mechanics that operate in society, there's a tendency to become desensitized or disillusioned with reality. So the idea of like fake news, if and I see this as people, not that society is becoming more gamified, but that people are becoming more aware of the gamification in society. The game was always there. Like you said, institutions, they're always games. And for someone growing up, they take life, life is real and life is this, but then they don't realize, oh, actually a lot of life is like a game, like the stock market, like companies buying and selling, and a lot of that is runs on game mechanics. But there are elements of it that when people realize that, becomes disillusioned. For instance, life is on the life is stacked against me, or like this, that this kind of idea where whatever game is being played in society, you're not able to play at the level that other people are playing at, and therefore you're getting left behind. But I also see this too with specifically this concept of fake news, and also with this, like the assassination attempts. So like in our history, or not history, in our lives, we never experienced I was never alive for any assassination attempt, and definitely not for two, right? That I don't think it's been like what, 50 years or 100 years or something. but the way people have brushed it off have turned it into some kind of like, it's almost as if it's not taken seriously, kind of like, oh, it's a game. It's like, like this game mechanic has seeped into our consciousness, to whereas, the media, everything is becoming a little bit game-like, but not the positive elements of the game, but the negative elements of the game. For instance, one being that it's just a game, it's not that serious, it doesn't have that consequence. But then we realize, well, there are actual consequences. If someone gets assassinated, there's actual consequences there. So I'm very interested in how our awareness of game mechanics has the potential to lead us to disillusionment or being too frivolous in how we, and I think there's a difference between being frivolous and play. Like, the artist, like if life is a creative, playful, interactivity, and you enjoy, like what you said about Dewey, like you enjoy doing something and so you do it, that concept of play, that there is a difference between that concept and the concept of, oh, life is just a game, so it doesn't really matter what you do and nothing really means anything. Like there's a similarity between them. Like it's easy to understand how one individual could interpret something in either direction. Life is playful, creative, or life is just, it doesn't have that, it's not that important, so you do whatever you want or whatever. And I think that's implications for society. And I think the more people who are choosing oh yeah, like, oh, it's just an assassination, oh, it's just more fake news, and oh, like, the potential is there for those kind of people to be used or controlled by people who understand how the game is played.
Right. Yeah, I think that's why I want to be very clear about the concept of game. And like you said before, like when the consequences become too serious, become too real world in a game, it's no longer a game, really, right? It's just real life. Like if you lose all your money, if you really die for real at the end of the game, that's real life. It's no longer a game anymore. And when you take like but then when kind of the opposite thing happens, when you take real life and you kind of no longer care as much about the actual real world consequences, which is like, well, it's just a game. We're going to deploy these strategies and, kind of screw the consequences of this. That's also not like that's not a good way to play life, the game of life, right? So you have like these, two things where you don't want your games to become too real. You don't want your reality to become too game-like, at least as I've been using the concept of games. So yeah, that's why I want to keep these
Nice. That seems
concepts.
like a good place to end it on that. That's an interesting
All
point.
right. All right. Well, it's been a really interesting conversation. I think I learned a lot. And hopefully people will enjoy listening to it. Any final thoughts? Well, I should mention maybe check out. I always forget to say this, but check out Daniel's work. I don't know which side he'll be on in the recording, but check out Daniel's work on Medium and academia.edu and YouTube, his YouTube channel, which you might be watching this on anyway. And I'll put links for my stuff and his stuff in the description. So.
And what about your upcoming conferences? You want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I've got 3 upcoming talks, 2 conferences, and one kind of lecture kind of thing. Um, the lecture will be on philosophy of music, and then I'm doing a couple of talks, conferences, one on kind of literary theory or philosophy of literature, and then another talk which will be sort of related to this on the relationship between literature and games and transmediation and stuff like that. And there will be, I'll post versions of these
Awesome.
online when I have a chance. So,
Oh, great. Well, it's wonderful talking to you again, David.
yeah, great talking to you.
All right. Bye-bye.